I'd like to welcome everybody today to our event hosted by Trend Micro and NewsGuard. My name is Lynette Owens. I'm the founder and global director of Trend Micro's Internet Safety for Kids and Families program, and we're really pleased to be able to host today's event with this illustrious panel. A couple of things about the event and also about this particular week and why we chose to host it today. Trend Micro and NewsGuard are excited to host this conversation to support Media Literacy Week, which is a time that we dedicate to recognize the importance of media literacy education as a 21st century skill that should be taught to every citizen beginning at as young an age as possible. And when we talk about media literacy, what we're talking about is the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, create, and act using all forms of communication. And in its simplest terms, media literacy builds upon the foundation of traditional literacy and offers new forms of reading and writing. It empowers people to be critical thinkers and makers and effective communicators and active citizens. Today, more than half the world, or 4.57 people, are on the internet. They are consuming, producing, sharing, and relying upon information that people all over the world are posting there, organizations and individuals alike. But it's become increasingly difficult to distinguish between fact and fiction, between what we can trust and what we can't. The purveyors of misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, scams, hoaxes, phishing, bots continue to infiltrate our feeds and our screens with seemingly no end in sight. We simply cannot continue on this trajectory without intervention. And especially when we know it can have the impact that it can on someone's privacy and personal safety, can sway the outcome of an election, or even put an entire nation's public health at risk. So we've assembled this fantastic group of speakers and experts to talk about the challenges we're facing today. And we hope to engage them and you, our audience, in a conversation about the ways that we can overcome those challenges. So throughout the discussion, I encourage you to submit questions at any time, which we will get to towards the end. You're also able to chat directly to your panelists at any time, and we will reserve time at the end to address those questions in the time we have left. So I'm going to start with introducing our panelists here. Today we have Eric Efron, who is the editorial director at NewsGuard. We have Stephen Hilt, who is a senior threat researcher at Trend Micro. We also have Darren Linville, associate professor in the Department of Communication at Clemson University. And shortly we'll be joined by Chloe Culliver, the head of policy and strategy at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. So welcome, everybody.
Great to be here.
Great, and I'd like to start with you, Eric. And then we'll move around the panel. If you could tell us briefly who is NewsGuard and what it is you do there.
Sure, great. Thanks so much for putting on this panel and for letting us be a part of it. This is such an important issue for us and for all of our fellow humans, actually. NewsGuard is a 2.5-year-old startup. Our business, our role is to rate and review news and information sites based on some very basic, what we consider journalistic criteria. We are not in the business of fact-checking individual articles per se. What we are doing is we're making judgments and sharing information about the standards and practices of the websites themselves. And so what we are looking for, and we do this without an ideological or political or partisan agenda, is how do the websites adhere to some very basic standards? Do they tell you who owns them? Do they ever run corrections? Are the headlines accurate or are they misleading? If they have an agenda or a perspective, do they tell you what it is? They're a conservative. Do they say we're a conservative site? Or do they hide the ball? And by putting a report together on every one of these websites and really demonstrating by showing and not telling how the site advances its mission. What we are doing is trying to give consumers of that information more information about the media that they are consuming, so they can make judgments for themselves about how much credibility to give to this particular site.
Great. So it's probably pretty dull days for you.
Yeah, right. I mean, I wish it was a little duller actually right now. Listen, since we've started this mission, there's never been a shortage of misinformation and disinformation. But as I'm sure everybody in this panel knows and people in our audience know, unfortunately, there's more than ever, more of that information or misinformation than ever. And it sometimes gets even harder to sort it out. So unfortunately, what we're doing now is more valuable than ever.
Absolutely. I think, and my understanding is the growth of internet traffic in general. So it's not just the numbers of people who've been, joining the internet for the first time, but it's also the amount of time each of us has been spending online. As I'm sure, I believe that Zoom fatigue will probably be in one of the new phrases in the dictionary by the end of the year. Well, Zoom and then Zoom.
Right. Oh, and the other
Zoom
factor
fatigue.
is as people consume media more and more by receiving it through search or through social. So they're not even making a decision, well, I'm going to go to this website and see what news there is. It's coming to them. And so it's even more important that as that information comes into their orbit, that they are able, that people have some way of making a judgment about this website. And that's really where we fit in.
Great, thank you. Thank you. And Stephen, while misinformation is certainly a pollutant, if you will, that many of us are worried about, think about a lot, are working hard to overcome. There's also another area of concern on the internet, and that is cybercrime. I have to confess, I was one of the people, probably a remnant of the Experian hack, who found out recently that I was a victim of identity theft. My understanding is that it's on the rise as well over this period of time during the pandemic. A combination of perhaps people looking for work or unemployed, as well as the fact that we're just all online so much more that perhaps our vulnerabilities are higher. But so can you talk a little bit about trends, and also about what you do? I think you as a researcher, I'm envious. I think you have one of the best jobs at Trend, to be honest with you.
I'm not going to argue with that fact. I do really enjoy my job. I have a lot of fun with it, and I have a lot of fun on the team that I work for, which is I work for specifically Trend Micro Research, but on a team called the Forward Looking Threat Research Team. So what we're supposed to be doing is looking for future trends of what cyber criminals will be up to in a year, 2 years, 3 years down the road. And so what we're trying to do now is take a look into what's going on during the pandemic and see if there's any trends of things that we might be able to predict of what's going to happen in the near future. And while right now crime seems to be on the rise, and we've released stories about, last week, my team that I work on released a research piece about what criminals are actually doing in their leisure time during the pandemic, which is almost gambling with people's identities and lives, and that they're trying to entertain themselves because they can't go out, and they do it in a criminal type behavior. And one of the big things that we're seeing a big rise in is what in 2017 kind of came to about, which was taking ransomware to a new level, which is called doxware, which is where they are taking documents and other artifacts from companies or smaller cases, individuals, and then they hold those files that they've taken, more of the ransom. You're not going to get your computers back. Secondly, if you don't pay us, we're going to release these documents. And there's actually dedicated websites these campaigns are doing in which they release this information out if you don't pay them. So that's one of the reasons why you're seeing larger payouts for ransomware, is to keep those files private. And also, while during this pandemic, you're hearing a lot in the news about COVID-related things. One of the facts that we recently we've been talking about recently is while there's a lot of lures on the internet for COVID-related phishing and other things, and it is in the millions per month. One of the things we want to remind people is while that is in a millions of lures per month, that is a fraction of 1% of the malicious URLs.
Okay, lures, meaning just links that might be
Links,
in my
phishing,
social media feed,
yep.
in my email, I might receive a spam. Does that include text phishing or, sorry, smishing, I think is the technical term.
I think it would be in there. Smishing is not very overly large in what Trend Micro processes and from a volume. But, you know, as we do and categorize websites and look at things coming in, that's kind of the information that we're basing a lot of that information off of, is the things that we see is it's a fraction of 1% of the malicious URLs.
I guess that's good news.
It is,
Putting
and
in that perspective.
And a lot of it is we have to take into account that right now that's very topical. So anytime it's in the news, you pay attention to it.
Yeah.
And a lot of the other stuff has kind of died down. You don't necessarily worry about a lot of the other phishing links or things like that, because that's just commonplace now.
Okay. All right. Great. Thank you, Stephen. And Darren, I know you're in the middle of teaching this semester as well, so thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. I know you've done a lot of studies about another area of concern, which isn't necessarily related to content, but humans, well, not humans, trolls and bots. And I want to encourage people, by the way, to take the test, a site that Darren and his partners, I believe, developed called spotthetroll.org. I did not do so well in your testing. Which one is a troll? Is this a troll or is this not? But I encourage the audience to go ahead and do that. Thanks for putting that together.
It's the journey, not the destination, Lynette.
It is the journey. Thank you for making me feel better. So I'd love to hear from your perspective over the course of, either this last 7 months or even before that. What have you been seeing as you've been tracking the behavior, the role of bots and trolls? How would you characterize this as a pollutant or a threat on the internet right now?
Sure. So here at Clemson, we've spent the past several years trying to understand the strategy and tactics of online trolls. We focused on the work of the Internet Research Agency, a group out of St. Petersburg, Russia, made famous by the Mueller report. But in studying their work, you learn a lot about disinformation and troll activity more broadly, because a lot of other actors have started to mimic what they do. Both other nation states, Iran, China, Venezuela, Cuba recently has started their own trolling campaign that I've seen the edges of myself, and domestic actors as well. And it's been interesting to see how these tactics have developed over time. I think one of the biggest takeaways in looking at the difference between what we saw in 2016 and what we see today is that, the life of a disinformation operation, the life of a troll, is not as easy as it used to be quite honest. I mean, back in 2016, they were paying for Facebook ads in rubles. That's not a joke. They were actually paying for Facebook ads in rubles. And signing up for their, Twitter accounts with Russian phone numbers, and they were doing things. Their accounts were networked in such a way that they just couldn't get away with today. And today, you see their accounts are much smaller than they were in the past. Back in 2016, they had accounts that had on Twitter 150,000 followers, and Instagram even larger than that. And those accounts, could have a significant influence on a given conversation. More recently, we've identified activity that we attributed to the Russian Internet Research Agency as recently as March, and a few accounts in May. They seem to be running more mid-sized accounts, as my colleague Patrick put it. They want to be influential but not memorable, and they're not networked together in the same way that they used to be. So their life is harder, but the other side of that is that there's a lot more actors out there engaging in this activity than there were in 2016. The salad days, the easy times are behind us, but there's a lot more garbage out there, and there's just a lot more domestic misinformation than we had in the past.
That's interesting. So would you characterize, if you were to compare 2016 to 2020, is the average lifespan of a troll account, I don't know, the average life of let's say a small animal, and we're down to a fruit fly lifespan, or whatever analogy
Sure.
you want to use?
That is very difficult to judge because
Okay.
The only population I can study are either the population that I've identified myself, which is small. We're just one set of researchers here at Clemson, or the population that one of the platforms has already killed. And it's not particularly useful to study lifespans of dead things. So you're going to have a biased sample, is my point. So it's
Right.
very hard to answer big picture questions because we don't know what we don't know.
Right.
And I
Okay.
can tell you, while there are a lot of operations out there that are clearly bad at their job, there are also professionals that are very good at it, and they are very sophisticated, and it's harder and harder for the platforms to identify some of that activity, even on their own
Right.
platform.
Okay, great. Thank you, Darren. And we are joined by Chloe Culliver. Thank you for joining us, Chloe. I understand you were quite busy doing something very important prior to this. So
thank you for having me, and many apologies for being late, but very glad to be here.
Yes. So while we have you, I'd love to hear from you. Tell us a little bit about the Institute for Strategic Dialogue and what your role and your team's role is there.
So the Institute for Strategic Dialogue is a think tank based mostly out of London, but working globally. It's been around for about 15 years. We predominantly work on issues of hate, extremism, and polarization. But in the last few years, what that's meant is that the disinformation crisis that we've seen has really come into our purview as a tool or a tactic of some of those hate and extremist movements that they use in their propaganda and in their activities. So my team, which is the digital analysis team, has a large set of analysts who look across those issues and really try to understand how hate groups, disinformation purveyors, or extremist groups are using different online platforms and for what purposes and ends.
Fantastic. And are you, a question about that, because I don't know if there's a way that you prioritize what it is you're going to analyze. I think I was just saying yesterday, there are an average of 500 million tweets just on Twitter every day. So we're talking how many platforms, that times how many platforms. Is there a way that you prioritize what you're analyzing?
Yeah, absolutely. So we think about breaking this into 3 streams of work, really. One of those is actually more like ethnographic work. It's kind of digital ethnography. And that's where researchers who have real subject matter expertise are in some of the more closed and fringe platforms, where we see a lot of these information campaigns coordinated and planned. So that acts as a kind of prioritization or early warning system for us in a number of ways to understand the strategies and the tactics and the narratives that we think are going to be important to some of these groups, nefarious bad actors. The second stream of work is then the kind of much larger scale data analytics work. So across the major platforms that have API access and enable us to do kind of large scale analytics work to understand either something from an actor perspective, so if we want to follow a known set of accounts, pages, groups, or from a narrative perspective. So we have subjects or issues or key terms that we know we want to be analysing or interested in, and that's how we'll go about cross-platform, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Reddit, and such, really digging into those networks at scale. And then finally, there's the OSINT team. So that often comes at the end of the pipeline, which is when we want to be able to do some work on attribution or to really dig into the infrastructure or the ownership of some of these online networks. So the 3 of those things help us to sort of triage information flows and to be able to kind of pick out and select what we think are going to be priority issues for us.
Okay. So, I mean, if you were to reflect on the last 7 months again, would you say that it's getting worse? Is it the same as it was before we went into the pandemic? How would you characterize that?
If I'm focusing in on specifically the issue of kind of hate and violence online, my vision on this at the moment is very much coming from the US elections context, where we're doing a lot of work at the moment. And I think that my optimism is low. I would say that the mainstreaming of these kinds of activities online is really concerning. So we're seeing the spread of hateful and divisive and often violent narratives and activity across a much broader range of actors than we might have seen a few years ago. And the same is true in Europe, where we do a lot of work as well. So that would be one thing that I'd pinpoint as a kind of really concerning trend. The kind of platform infrastructure that we see for this is also very different to a kind of 12 months ago or something. We have seen kind of drastic reactionary policies by major platforms like Facebook and Twitter to try and deal with some of these threats around disinformation or hate. But what that does is that gives us another set of problems to deal with, which is the kind of popping up of all sorts of fringe and closed platforms and forums where a lot of this is coordinated and planned. And it makes the job of really understanding what's going on and how that's impacting audiences online even more difficult in many ways, because we're having to really build new infrastructure and understanding of these other online spaces. So that's definitely a kind of double-edged sword in some ways for research.
Well, and I think that political processes, I think we know, have always been an accelerant for people rushing to the internet for any reason anyway, just to be informed. But I want to ask you, and actually I want to open this to the whole panel. What we know we're turning the corner on with regard to this pandemic is a vaccine. And I don't know to what degree your work is sort of paying attention to this, but we know that at the beginning of the pandemic that there was a lot of misinformation, hoaxes, scams, phishing, techniques around either preventative, solutions or even treatments for COVID-19 early on. Eric, I know that you've had a tracker on this as part of NewsGuard's work, and Stephen, I know we similarly were tracking this, those kinds of sites and content that had a malicious payload, more to harm you from a financial perspective. But I don't know, can anyone comment on or anything you're seeing trend-wise in terms of the vaccine, which we're all so desperately hoping for, but need to be truly clearly informed about, because this is a matter of life and death if we're not going to the places that are most reputable and not serving the most accurate information to us.
Yeah, so starting probably in about March, is that when this nightmare started? I guess it was about March. We started identifying websites that were advancing trafficking in bad information about COVID-19. And I think after about a week or two, we were up to about 100 sites, and we were really, sort of amazed at that. And then we hit 150, and then 200, and then 250, and then 300. And you get the picture. We're up to around 350 now. And these are websites these are not just random, obscure little websites. These are websites that have significant social media engagement. So that's been something that we've been watching right from the beginning. And you're absolutely right. As there's been more talk and more expectation about a vaccine, we're starting to see more and more information or misinformation about vaccines. And one interesting trend, and maybe it's not that surprising, but it's probably worth noting, is that a lot of the websites that were already publishing bad information about vaccines, the part of the, broadly speaking, the anti-vax movement, they jumped right on the bandwagon for raising concerns, some of them legitimate, some of them questionable, about the progress toward a vaccine for COVID-19. So, and as you know, there's already been a lot of skepticism and resistance among certain elements of the public about vaccines in general. And in the current environment where everything is so politicized and polarized, we're finding that's even more the case, because now you have, people on the left who may be concerned about a vaccine simply because President Trump is the one that's kind of touting it. So, you have now, coming from sort of all sides, a kind of growing critical mass of resistance and skepticism about a vaccine. And that, of course, is reflected in what we see on news and information sites.
Okay, yeah. I don't, Stephen, if there's anything you've been tracking with regard to, misinformation that's actually designed with some kind of payload, whether it's, clickbait or some other kind of payload.
So early on, as I mentioned earlier, fraction of 1%, that doesn't take into account any of the actual successes. That's just the volume that we're seeing. I know for a fact that having, early on in COVID, the lures for phishing and other attacks using it were very successful, because it was what people wanted information around. It's what people wanted. So they were more likely to click something. They were more likely to download something, to interact with it. The same thing is going on for vaccines. We'll kind of relate that together. And I know, Lynette, you probably know this too, our own company sent out a phishing exercise using COVID, and I think they got a higher click rate during that exercise in themselves, just because people wanted that information. So you're definitely seeing that people are more susceptible to something that's very more emotional right now.
Yeah, and you bring up a really good point. I'd like to ask both Eric and Chloe, Darren and Chloe, to comment on this, because there's one thing to create the pollution, but then there's another for people to either ignore the pollution and leave the trash on the ground and make the internet more a worse place. So what is it? What is the characteristic about the misinformation campaign, the design of the troll? What is behind their efficacy? Why do we fall for this? And why do we play a role in letting these things persist? What is it about them that we should understand better?
Well, there have been, studies that show that if you are prone to accept one conspiracy theory, you're the type of person that would be open to other kinds of conspiratorial thinking. And so we do have sites that basically specialize in conspiracy theories, and they know that they have an audience that is kind of open to that. So the claim that if you get a vaccine, Bill Gates will have put a microchip in there that's going to follow you around and know everything you do. That may sound outlandish to us, but if you're somebody who believes in Bill Gates type conspiracy theories, it may actually just feed in what your preconceptions are about vaccines and about Bill Gates. So I think there's sort of an exploitation of what people's already kind of established proclivities are to kind of accept this kind of information. Yeah, Chloe, did you have?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's interesting to consider this depending on the intent behind the disinformation or misinformation. So if you look at, for example, some of the longer running foreign state disinformation campaigns targeting elections, I think what's interesting there is that actually part of the impact strategy, if you will, is that they want these things to be found, and they want to undermine people's trust in any information they're seeing. So it's actually a kind of double loss for the users who are seeing this stuff, because not only are they being exposed and continually to misinforming content or misleading content, but equally when it's found out that these are deceptive actors and networks behind these, it's a whole nother level of distrust and erosion of trust in the media and information that you're seeing. So there's a kind of double level of difficulty there and challenge there, I think, for users having to deal with this kind of thing. Whereas if you look at kind of commercially driven, perhaps, misinformation and disinformation, slightly different set of considerations, and probably a different set of kind of enticements that are being used to try and attract clicks, engagement, and whatever it might be, that are probably more based around marketing than maybe kind of ideological underpinnings of how to enrage or sow chaos and division. So I think there's very different types of push factors that are being used that keep people clicking, keep people engaged in this kind of misleading or false content, depending on the actor that's behind that.
Yeah, although I think in common with, between what you've said, Eric said, and Stephen said so far, I think that the one thing in common is appealing to some emotional response from us, whether it is to confirm a bias or it's I'm afraid. I'm afraid I don't want to get sick. I need this vaccine. And Darren, you've done
is, inherently, an emotional issue for people, right? I mean, it's their health. One of the things we discovered early on at NewsGuard when we started, we were much more focused on political sites. And then we quickly discovered that not only is there more health misinformation out there, but arguably it's more dangerous. It's one thing to have a kind of a cockamamie idea about where Obama was born. And it's another thing to think that if you, rub, inhale or drink bleach, it will help you ward off COVID-19. So these are not only more emotional issues, but they're ones that I think, everybody, regardless of your politics, everybody cares about their health and their family's health. And so they are even more open and maybe even more desperate for information.
Absolutely. And, I think, Darren, with the work that you've been doing, I know that just going through that stop the troll, I keep wanting to say spotthetroll.org, not stop the troll.
Right.
We want to stop the troll, but yes, it's spot.
Both are true. We considered both names, actually. Yeah.
Okay. But going through that exercise, I realized you start to learn there's something common about each of these accounts. And so could you describe that for our audience? What is it we should be, and they appeal, I think they appeal to that emotional response as well.
Yeah, I think Stephen, Eric, and Chloe were all making fantastic points. And one thing that all of these things have in common, whether it's, phishing or state-sponsored disinformation or monetized disinformation, is an attempt to persuade you of something you are already inclined to believe. So one reason we included in the troll quiz an individual who was clearly monetizing his misinformation was to sort of teach that very lesson, that these things are very similar. Their motives are different, but their tactics are the same. Individuals who are trying to sell vitamins on their website and often use the same tactics and strategies that the Russian IRA does, which are the same tactics and strategies that, frankly, Budweiser uses to sell beer. They're making emotional pitches to make you go. They're trying to pull you along with them, not push you away. Trolls are your friends, or at least they're pretending to be. They're not actually. And that's true whether it's an ideological troll run by the Russians or, somebody selling misinformation on their website in order to get your attention and get you to engage on their website and buy whatever product it is that they're shelling. So, for instance, whether you're talking about Alex Jones or naturalnews.com, the content on these websites is incredibly emotional, and there's usually a very common theme to them that is going to get people who may be of the sort of conspiratorial lean that Eric was talking about. I recently did some analysis for a journalist friend of mine looking at QAnon, this online conspiracy that suggests that pedophile cannibals are in control of the world governments and economy. And when you look at that, the prevalence of QAnon messages over time, over the past 3 years, it grew very quickly to a sort of baseline level of 2.5 million tweets a month or so, with a given set of hashtags that we analyzed, and it stayed there, and it didn't grow and it didn't shrink, because as Eric said, there is a certain percentage of humans that are inclined to believe these messages, and they can be targets.
Yeah, and I think that brings me to the next part of our conversation, and that is, what is the answer? How, so far what we've heard is that all of these kinds of risks, while they may be motivated by different reasons, are successful for very similar reasons. But how can we then? What are some of the answers to overcoming this problem? Is this an issue of more technical innovations in the distribution platforms of the information? Is it legislative in response? Is it a change in human behavior? Is it all of the above, none of the above? So I'd like to go around the panel and start with Chloe. What are your thoughts? How can we intervene? How can we clean up and save the internet?
So I think if we're looking at this in a sustainable long-term way, there's a few things we need to think about, and some are the sort of incentive structures for technology companies, and some of them are kind of user-based approaches. So on the user-based side, we do a lot of work on things like digital citizenship and media literacy, and I know that NewsGuard and others do as well. That is always going to be a core part of, the basic level of understanding of critical thinking around online consumption, but it's never going to solve this problem for us, because if you look at the data, education is not really a vulnerability factor that affects whether people believe misinformation or not. It's actually, this stuff is really compelling for a number of reasons. So it's definitely part of the equation, but it certainly won't help us get much further in cleaning up the state of the internet. So what we've been doing a lot is thinking about, are there regulatory structures that are safe and responsible for human rights that can actually help to incentivize platforms to create and design themselves to be healthier spaces for civic discourse, and to disincentivize hosting mis and disinformation? So there's some really interesting proposals from the UK government and from the EU at the moment that look at, right, how do we not think about content? So how do we not think about what's right and wrong in terms of content? But how do we look at, incentivizing technology companies to be kind of safety by design, for example, as an aspect of thinking for technology companies? Or how do we think about rigorous and kind of accountable transparency for how information flows are structured, and why certain people are being funneled to certain kinds of information, not others? So there are definitely kind of fundamental principles of how we can kind of oversee our information sphere. And those really have to be down to democratic governments, I think. We can't just ask tech companies to be coming up with every rule and every enforcement protocol themselves, because at this point, this is part of our public sphere, and it's a communal job for us to be making sure that there are the right structures to make sure our information space is a better place. It's never going to be entirely clean and clear of all of these harms, just like the real world won't be. But there's certainly ways, I think, to incentivize companies to build their products and processes in ways that enable us to have oversight over why these problems occur and how we can fix them a bit better.
That's certainly one perspective. I'd love to hear from the others on the panel. Stephen, any thoughts on how we can solve some of these issues?
If I had all the solutions, we'd already be there. But the hard part is, as more and more people get computers in their pockets, is where we're running into a lot of issues. So I agree with Chloe on the users and technology. It can't be in the technology, where we work. It can't be all on us. The users do need to take some ability to learn and understand some of that information that's coming in. We always, in computer security, have always said, don't click on the links. Now you get emails that even tell you that say you don't click on a link unless you trust it from that person. And we're still being, attackers are still successful with embedding information in places to lure people into getting, their attack to be successful. So we need to definitely have a multi-layered approach to going forward, kind of where we've been, but we just need to get it to a lot more people. And that's definitely the hard part. But one of those nice things about what we're doing here today, which is trying to talk to more people and bring awareness around a lot of the things that we know and understand.
Absolutely. And I think one of the issues is, oh, sorry, Eric, I was just going to ask you, the friction is something that I often talk about, that there's not enough friction in the system, that today, if you wanted to be one of the world's most famous bloggers, you could today, if you wanted to. It's too easy for me to post. It's too easy for me to respond, to share, to react, and without having to think about it. So I'd love to get your thoughts, though. I mean, on friction in general, if there's enough of it inherently in the systems, but also in response to what Chloe and Stephen have said so far. How do we solve this problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think at NewsGuard, we really do approach this issue journalistically with the belief that more information is always going to be better, and that the more information you have as a citizen, the more informed your decisions will be. So the thinking here, and as I mentioned before, is as we encounter this content, how can we signal to users that some information about the level of credibility and transparency of this website that's providing them with this information, and in a very detailed way. So you have as much or as little information as you want about this website. The way that NewsGuard works is you actually get a little shield, either a green or red shield, that travels around with the URL, depending on your browser, that you can click on and get all this information about the website. So it's a kind of an idealistic position, and I know that it's not the only solution, but we believe that if people knew that the website that they're looking at has a history of publishing demonstrably false news, that will affect how that person judges that website. So we work with ISPs and others to bring our shields and to bring our data to as wide an audience as possible. Plus, consumers can individually download our plugin. So there's lots of different ways of getting NewsGuard, but the point is that the more you know about the media you consume, the smarter your consumption decisions will be.
And I think there's something to that, because I think prior to having labels on food packaging, you may have been more inclined to have ice cream for breakfast. And I'm exaggerating a bit here, but it changed our eating behavior when we understood what we were eating, what we were actually putting into our bodies.
Right. Which,
and I think that is
we call our website reviews nutrition labels for that very reason.
And Darren, your thoughts on how we can solve some of these challenges?
First of all, Lynette, during a time of COVID, there is nothing wrong with ice cream for breakfast.
Yes, I was waiting for that
100% acceptable behavior. So I saw, with your initial question, and I was shaking my head vigorously at the idea that the platforms are going to solve this. I saw Chloe laughing at me. But I do want to say I agree with everything Chloe said. That this is an issue that needs to be addressed from all sides. I am perhaps just a little more skeptical that the platforms will actually make any of the fundamental changes that would truly be necessary to address some of the problems, based off of the fact that those changes would run counter to their financial incentives. And these are, of course, for-profit industries. And that is frustrating. Some of the platforms have made some choices more recently that I think have made some positive changes. Twitter, in particular, I've been proud of some of what they've done. Some of that might be because they see political winds changing, but they have made some good decisions. Although they have had some trouble with consistency in how they apply those changes. Facebook's just the worst. But it is also on us as consumers of media and social media. When I go out on the roads, I I want my roads to be well maintained, and I want my car to be safe, and I want my airbag to work, but I'm still going to try to be a safe driver. And maybe it's because I live in South Carolina, my roads are awful, that I'm pessimistic about the platform's ability to make meaningful change.
Well, and you bring up a good point, and that is, we are having this conversation in the midst of Media Literacy Week, which, to all of you, I agree as well that this got to be a comprehensive approach in order for it to be sustainable, as Chloe put it. Because I am skeptical always about sort of self-regulation as an answer. I want to put this question out to you because it's when you think about the incentives, it's because I can search on Google for free, and I can open up a TikTok account for free, and I can do a whole lot of things on the internet for free. So, what do people think about a paid model?
That's also what makes disinformation so very cheap to produce. Yeah, it's one thing that makes it asymmetrical warfare, is that all of these bad actors can so the costs are so low. The cost of the entire Internet Research Agency campaign in the run-up to 2016 was $1.5 million a month. The cost of a most recent line B-21 bomber is roughly $550 million unit price. So, you tell me where China and Russia and Iran want to compete in the near future, given that Russia's economy is roughly the size of Texas. It's much more likely going to be in disinformation because it's cheap, and there's no downside. I mean, we catch them and do nothing, and so yeah, I think that raising the costs of production of disinformation, however we can do that, is a good thing.
Thoughts from the others? Do you see yourself paying for Google search?
Well, Lynette, as we teach our kids in internet safety for kids and family when I go to schools, it's not free. Read the terms of service. There's a price for it, and it's your privacy. So it's definitely not, I don't necessarily know that a paid model for everything will work, because there'll still probably be some of those aspects, because we pay for TV and we get ads. So is the paid model going to get rid of everything? Probably not.
I think if you look at the infrastructure that allows it to be free, so if you look at the way that advertising is targeted and distributed at the moment, there's been some really interesting studies recently to look at how ineffective that advertising is for brands in many ways, and how actually if you changed that and you flipped that on its head somehow and went back to contextual advertising, where it's based actually on what you're looking at and the page you're on, rather than all of your past 8 months of data from cookies around the internet, that actually you're more likely to click on that advert and show an interest. There was really interesting experiments in the Netherlands around this with the public broadcaster. So I do think if there were ways to move our entire kind of approach to data harvesting and targeting into a slightly more constructive place, that actually you might be able to retain free services, but also lessen the incentive for these companies to be harvesting as much about you as you could, your personal data, and therefore to be building systems that are targeting content at you for that reason. So there may be ways we can think about, the underlying monetary infrastructure of what's going on here, and think about new ways of doing that would bring about kind of less harm to users through the data approaches that are in place at the moment.
That's it. Yeah. I think that's something to be said about, recency of, our behavior, and tying that to what I'm seeing, the algorithms that are controlling my life as it feels some days. Eric, any thoughts on the monetization piece?
Well, it's just that I think both from the sellers and the buyer standpoint, I think there's motivation on both sides, and I think that they'll find each other. I don't see, the pay model as a solution here to false news, because I think that people are always looking for it and others are always looking to provide it. So, I think some of the other things that we've talked about, certainly the platforms doing more, consumers being more informed, I think all of those are probably, more fruitful avenues of reform.
Yeah, I want to be clear. I wasn't actually I was gray sky thinking the pay model won't actually happen, given with the actual cost to us of social media is so buried that we never see it. That makes it much more appealing, and that's why it will be sustained.
Well, and I haven't done any research on this, but when YouTube launched their paid models, is it YouTube Red, I think. I don't know to what degree that's been. At the end of the day, it's the content, and people, if you're providing a value enough, people will be willing to pay for it.
I don't know how many times I have to tell YouTube I don't want their service.
The problem with social media is the value are our family and our friends, and who are they to tell us who we value in our circles? And I think that's what makes it difficult as well. What I'd like to do is we've had some questions coming in from the audience, so I want to make sure we leave some time to address a couple of these. One question while we're on this topic is, would a nonprofit model for social media help like Wikipedia? I guess it'd be sort of crowdsourcing. To that point, Wikipedia for some people provides a great service, and so they're willing to, when those little pop-ups come, if you really like this, $3 is all we need. Any thoughts on that kind of a model?
Right. Reddit is, sorry, go ahead, Chloe.
No, you go for it. I think you're about to say the same thing I was about to say. So.
Reddit is along those lines. And it's a very bottom-up approach with the users, monitoring engagement. And lots of research suggests it is the best platform for meaningful civic conversation and better than any of the other mainstream models. So yes, I think it's a good idea.
I'd add on to that. There's some really interesting discussions around what public service media means in the internet age, and thinking about whether you could build a public service platform, not just public service broadcasters doing stuff online, but actually, if you think about the underpinnings of public service media and why it was created and what its principles are meant to be, that still applies now in the internet age, and it would be interesting to see if you could build platform design to fit with that, and that would be funded, through the same means as public service media is offline and in broadcast. So there's some really, really great discussions around that as well that fits in that slightly different framework for thinking about non-profit mechanisms for building these sorts of things.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, Eric or Stephen, any comments on that?
Nothing to add.
No? Okay.
Yeah, nothing to add.
Another question that's come in, what laws or regulations would be effective in creating transparency from the providers? And actually, I would couple that question with, what does transparency look like, first of all, and then what types of policy might enforce that?
I'm happy to take a stab quickly at this. So we've laid out in a paper recently 4 areas that we think require meaningful transparency. So one of those is content and content moderation. A second is advertising. A third is appeals and redress. So if something is being taken down or removed, what processes are there to remedy that? And the fourth is algorithmic transparency. And I think the fourth one is the most interesting one, and also the most challenging. And there's some really fascinating stuff from the Ada Lovelace Institute and others coming out around actually what does that mean? Can we learn from the financial services industry? Are there ways of looking at the outcomes and impact of algorithms rather than the source code that would still be helpful for us to understand, how these are affecting users? So I think those 4 areas are where I chart the need, and transparency will look different for each of those, right? Kind of what documents or interviews or metrics do you require for rigorous transparency? That's a very difficult question to answer specifically for each of those. But there's definitely some ways you can think about an independent regulator that would be able to enforce that requirement for transparency. And actually, I think that's a much safer way to move forward than thinking about a regulator that would have to look at types of content or what is bad and what is good, but actually it's more of a sort of like corporate responsibility process in a way of reporting out on the processes, the people, the skills, the policy formation, those sort of macro level things that are going on around these issues online. And there's definitely in the UK online harms white paper some interesting ideas around that might be worth looking at. So yeah, I'll stop there. But I do think that there's some clear areas where transparency would be like the first bastion before we can make decisions on what else needs to happen.
I wonder how successful passing such legislation might be, what kind of pushback we might, witness from the platforms, because you're basically giving away the secret recipe, if you will. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I had the exact same thought, which is you're really going up against a sort of a very fundamental tenet from the tech industry, which is, their algorithms, their black boxes, their secret sauce, their recommendation algorithms, all of that. That's how they monetize themselves, and that's how they distinguish themselves from competitors. So I think it's a heavy lift to expect transparency from Facebook when they make billions and billions of dollars specifically because they're not transparent.
Absolutely.
The suggestions for this, though, are about having just an independent regulator be able to look at that. It wouldn't be publicly available. So I think there are ways that you could shield that.
Yeah. That sounds like medicine that's easier to take. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I agree. Well, we're at the top of the hour now, and I think, and we've had a few more questions, which thank you to everybody for submitting them. We'll actually try and get answered directly with you if we're able to contact you. You certainly can submit feedback at internet_safety@trendmicro.com at any time. Any questions that you might have for any of the panelists that dawn upon you after today. I want to thank our panelists, Chloe Culliver, Stephen Hilt, Eric Efron, and Darren Linville for joining us today. This was a fantastic discussion. We actually could have gone a little bit longer because this is no easy task. And I want to remind everybody, this is Media Literacy Week. If you are, it is one of the answers that we did discuss today in terms of how we could save the internet. And while we might not have control over the platforms or even the laws that govern them, we can each do something on our own. And that is to take time, to not react too quickly by the things we're seeing online, to ask questions, to do some research, and just slow things down. I think we could all benefit from slowing down a little bit. So again, thank you. I'm Lynette Owens with Trend Micro's Internet Safety for Kids and Families program. Thanks for everyone for listening today. We will have this session recorded and posted on our website. And I wish everybody a continued safe and healthy remainder of 2020 and hope to see you again in the new year. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.